Hey everyone, this is Sir Bala, and for this video, we're going to talk about unit testing and test-driven development. And specifically for this video, we're going to talk about what is unit testing, why we perform unit testing, and how it's done, and what is test-driven development, or TDD for short, and its benefits. So, what is unit testing? So, simple lang naman, no? This is just self-explanatory in term. We're testing a unit. And a unit could be either a function, a method in a class. No? But anyway, here's a more detailed definition for that. When we say unit testing, we are basically testing individual units of a program in isolation. Now, again, when we say unit, it could be a method or a function in a program. So let's say, for example, in a certain program, it has like 5 functions. So each of those functions, we're going to test them. Kasi yun nga, isolation, no? Kumbaga, we test first the function number 1, the function number 2, function number 3, so on and so forth. So yun yung ibig sabihin ng testing each individual unit in isolation. Kasi we don't test two methods at the same time. Isa-isa. No? 2 functions at the same time. 2 or 3 or more functions at the same time. Isa-isa talaga natin tinetest. No? And why do we do that is so that we ensure na the functions or methods or the units are working correctly. And here's an example of that. No? Let's say in a get expenses the use case, if you recall it in your domain layer, di ba? Yung mga unit cases has only one called method. No? And this is the unit in concern that we are going to test. No? For example lang. No? Now, given a certain method and event, whenever we test a certain unit, we will ask to ourselves if the method or function does it work as expected. So what are exactly the expectations in when we are testing certain function or method? First, we make sure that yung function or method na yun dapat correct yung i-return niya nga response or value. Also, we are also concerned with the behavior of that function or method na dapat it should behave accordingly sa gusto natin. No? It doesn't do other unrelated na mga instructions. So yun, to take note of these two because we will get back into this with a specific example. Basta yun. Again, whenever we conduct unit testing, we just make sure that our methods or functions return a correct response and performs correctly. Now, another thing with unit testing is if there are any dependencies in a certain function or method, we're going to mark and stop it. Because we're only focused lang sa function, unit test na are concerned. No? We're not concerned with the dependencies behavior, but rather the function that's relying on that dependency or dependencies. No? Kung maraming dependencies in that function. And then we have mocking, which is basically replacing real dependencies with simplified implementations called mocks. And what do you mean by that? Itong mocks na to. For example, diba, in our get expense, if you recall it in your the domain layer ng the code, iisa lang naman yung line of code niya, which is just going to call the get all expenses of the expense repository. So, therefore, in order for it to successfully perform its call method, it's going to need the help of this expense repository. So, therefore, we could say that expense repository is its dependency. And again, in testing, unit testing, dependencies are to be mock. Or in other words, we'll make a mock version or fake version of this dependency. Another thing that you need to be familiar with is stubbing. Basically, we are replacing the real method or function with a simplified implementation. And when we say simplified, pag tinawag tong function na yan, or method, meron na siyang predefined response. Kumbaga, it doesn't perform its instructions, that function, because in the first place, that dependency is fake, diba? So, wala pa yung instructions sa function na yan, no? But, of course, in order to simulate its behavior, that's why we are going to provide a sort of a script na, anyway, we have an example right here. So, going back, we have the get expense, no? Diba? Again, tatawagin ni get expense yung get expense function or method ni expense repository. And since this is a mock, no, so wala pa tong implementation na code, no, on how this get expense works, no. So we're going to stub this method, and by stubbing, we are giving a script na kapag ito yung tinawag get expense, is going to return a predefined object. Kumbaga basta yun lang take note nyo for now. We'll have a specific example for this later in our next slides. But yeah, again, going back, no, in unit testing, yung mga dependencies natin, we're going to mock them, and yung methods niya, we're also going to stub. Now, why do we do this? Why do we mock dependencies, no? Simple lang naman yung main reason for me, no? Just to improve the speed of our testing. Because we don't want na... Anyway, ganito kasi yan, no? When test that's relied on real dependencies, tendency is mabagal siya. And to give you an example of that, let's say, if you are testing your application, that's good na ma-communicate siya with an actual server na remote, chances are, pwedeng bamagal yung test kasi, let's say, for example, get all expense. What if yung records dun sa database sa server is 1,000? So, it's gonna take a while for the server to fulfill its role and return all those objects or expenses na in-request mo. That's another factor, no? Another thing is the internet connection between the application and the server, no? If mabagal yung internet connection mo, ganun din, babagal din yung render ng result. Pero then yung function that when we call a certain operation sa server or any other class, no, that function could perform complex computations that will take time. So yun, that's why instead of relying on real dependencies, we make a fake version of it so that pag tinawag natin yung function niya, it will right away return a response. Kasi fake nga eh. Kumbaga nabigyan na natin ng script na kapag, okay, pag we call this function, it's going to return this object. Pag ito yung function na tinawag natin, it's going to return this object. Anyway, we'll have an example for that later on, but yan lang muna yung take nyo. Okay, so now, let's talk about why unit test. Why we perform unit testing. Of course, the most obvious reason is we want to improve the code quality of our program, di ba? We don't want that before we deploy something, di ba, just like a food, no? We don't want to serve our customers with a spoiled food, di ba? We make sure that everything is okay. Our code is in top shape, no? It's working, it's returning values, it's behaving according correctly, no? So, yun. Also, in unit testing, we could catch bugs early. It could provide us a safety net for refactoring kasi once you already have placed all those test cases, no, you can safely reorganize or restructure your code para mas readable siya. Kasi pag rearrange mo sa code mo and then nag-fail siya bigla sa test case, so you know that there's something wrong with your program and you need to refactor it. Kaysa naman, nag-refactor ka and you didn't perform unit testing, chances are you already messed up your code. So, yun. And lastly is documents behavior. So, ito yung kagandahan with providing a series of possible scenarios or test cases function mo. Kasi it's already documenting that, for example, given this input, dapat ito yung output niya. Dapat sa ganitong input ito at nagkaroon ng error, this function should return like this. So, parang ganon, no? You are already providing some scenarios in this new method that we are testing, and in some way, it documents it gives us a documentation on what that function should be doing. Ano yung dapat proper output niya and proper behavior niya. Anyway, so much for that. Let's dive into how do we start a unit test. Tatlo lang yung kailangan natin gawin. No? We just repeat these 3 steps whenever we perform a unit test. Arrange, act, assert. So the first, let's check this let's have an overview of this test case natin. In this test case, we are trying to, yung scenario is, dapat we should be able to call the getExpense successfully. And it should be able to return the right values. So this is the one that we are performing, no? Itong act, no? But let's talk about yung arrange and assert, no? So arrange is basically we're just setting up the environment and preparing all the necessary conditions. Sort of preparation, no? Before the actual test, yung act, no? So in this case, in this step, no? We are initializing objects, yung classes, and yung dependencies niya. Then we're also preparing data inputs of the function that we're going to perform or act, no? And then we set up the mocks and stubs if there are dependencies. And here's an example for that, no? First, we set up the mock. This is how we make a mock version sa expense repository. So we just prefix lang mock. Expense repository extends the mock from the mocktail package. I will talk about this mocktail, no? And then we implement the expense repository na interface natin. So yan, ganun lang. In just one line of code, we're able to create a mock version of our expense repository. Then, again, in the arrange, this is where we initialize the objects, no? Line 16 and 17, we create the objects for our mock expense repository, and we create an instance of our use case, no? Get all expenses that we're going to test. And this is ito yung ibig sabihin ng stubbing, di ba? Stubbing the get all expenses method. So, ganito, if we're going to read this or interpret this, basically, when expense repository get all expense is called, kumaga, pag tinawag yung get all expense ng dependency natin na expense repository, ito yung predefined response niya. It's going to return a right object kasi diba in the future, meron tayong either left future, yung right is yung value niya. So that's why right yung dito, nakalagay dito. Anyway, going back, when the get all expense method is called, it will return daw a predefined response nga right, the expenses. Yun. So, here's another example. This time, in the case of add expense na use case. Same pa rin. Initialize objects, the object of the class that we are concerned with, tsaka yung dependency niya. Then, since add expense, in order to perform add expense, kailangan niya ng expense na object. So, we provide a data input. Yung kanina, this is, just to clarify lang, this is the return, expected return object. Anyway, we will go back into this. Hindi to input, kaya nga nilagay ko lang initialize objects kasi this is not an input but the response that we expect sa function. But anyway, going back, again, if a certain use case or class requires a certain input, yung function niya requires an input in order to perform its method, so we provide the data input. And as for the add expense, this time we are stubbing that expense in a scenario where pag tinawag na yung add expense with the new expense object, it will return a predefined response nga right null. And bakit null? Kasi we cannot return void. Kasi di ba pag add expense, it's either we're going to return failure or void. And di siya tumatanggap ng void kasi void is not a value. So, null yung ilalagay natin dito. And now, let's proceed with the act. Yung act is basically lang. We just perform the action or behavior or the function that we want to test. And specifically, of course, we call the function we're going to test and capture the result of that operation. For example, eto. So, in just one line of code, we're able to achieve those two. First, we call the function that we are testing. In this case, get all expense. We are testing this one. And if it returns something, which is obviously all expenses, get man. So, expected na is going to return one or more expenses. And in order for us to capture yung result, we create a variable so that ang i-return nito will be assigned to that variable. So, result now contains the list of expenses that was thrown or returned by this method or use case. And then finally, assert. Assert is where the testing actually, this is performing the action. This one is where most of our verification happens. We verify that the outcome of the action that we did kanina sa act is what we expect. So first, we assert to check if the result matches the expected value. And we can see that right here in line 40. So, we are comparing the result that was returned sa act to our expected na value. Okay? Kumbaga, in analogy, let's say for example, this right side, itong nasa right is the number 1. Number 1. Dapat, let me just, to give you a point, Kasi wag na lang numbers na para confuse. Let's say for example, my name, Stefan, step na lang. Yan, step. For example, yung value dito sa right is step. This is what are yung expected value natin. And this is the actual value that was returned by the function. So, dapat, eto, din, maging step din yan. Because what we want is, di ba, yung result na ni-return ng function should be equal to the value right here sa right. And If para sila ng value sa actual and sa expected, our test case will be correct. No? Mga approve yan. Pero kung hindi ito magkaparehas ng values, mag-fail yung test case natin. So, yan. As for this one, verify, we're just verifying lang naman if yung dependency, yung method ng dependency was called. The moment that we call the use case, did the use case perform talaga it's what it should be performing? It's a get all expense. Tinawag ba niya yung get all expense sa expense repository? And at the same time, we are checking if tinawag ba itong get all expense once. One time, isang beses. And then lastly, verify no more interactions. We are just checking just to be sure, no? Kung wala na bang ibang ginawang extra stuff yung get all expense, na ano ba siya? Did it try to edit? Did it try to delete? Or did it try to get all expense again? So yun, yan lang naman yung purpose nito. And yeah, that would be all for our test for the step number 3. So let me just erase everything. Oh, sorry. Okay, so now, before we ever write our unit test instructions, we have to run this command sa VS Code natin. So we basically download or install this mocktail na package, no, for testing. And since this is for testing purposes lang naman, that's why, let me just wait. Sorry. Let me just fix this. Okay, so going back. The reason we have a --dev because this is a package that's only concerned for development, for debugging. No? So yun lang, ibig sabihin yan. And this is what it looks like when you're going to enter this in your VS Code na terminal. So Flutter pub add mocktail --dev, and it will try to download the package, and of course it will require internet in order for this command to be successful. And this is what it looks like when you're able to successfully perform this command. So it's going to insert the mocktail package or the dependency sa pub spec natin. Okay, so let's have a quick demo on how we're going to... Actually, I'm not going to show you how to create this. I will just show you ano yung itsura ng code natin once we write this in VS Code. Now, let's start with the mock, no, expense natin. So, notice right here, no, we create a separate Flutter Dart file for the mock natin. And the reason that we create a separate file for that is because this mock expense repository will be used by this add expense. As you can see right here, we're going to import that for the add expense, and we're going to also import that for the get all expense. So yun yung purpose, yung reason bakit we separate this into a separate file. Then let's go with the get all expense natin. And yeah, these are just imports lang naman, but the first function right here is the main function. And then the first few lines is just basically declaring the objects natin. Then we have a setup. Yung ibig sabihin lang naman is this function will be called before each test case is run. Kumbaga, di ba, we have a test case right here. Before we jump into line 28, and kung meron pa ditong test cases dito na sumusunod, is going to first execute this one, setup. So, paulit-ulit tong tatawagin itong line 16 to 25 for each test case na present dito, test cases. So, isa lang naman yung test case natin. So, one time lang ito tatawagin. And yeah, in the setup, we just basically set up. We perform the arrange natin. Then, we have the test case natin. And that's pretty much about it. Same also with the add expense. So, parehas lang. But, nagkakaiba lang sila with, since add expense is requires an input. So, we also created input and we pass this input, new expense, dito sa test case natin. And yeah, that's pretty much about it with our, anyway, we're not going to deep dive with the code in this video kasi we're going to do that in our next video, which is we're going to create our we're going to go back to our repository implementation and we're going to perform test-driven development or unit test. So much for that, and we resume, or we go back to our slides, and let's talk about test-driven development. Basically, before that, diba, typically when we in programming, yung usually na nakasanayan is we first write the code, then tsaka pa natin siya i-test if gagana ba siya, diba? But in test-driven development, it's the reverse. And what do you mean by reverse? Kasi yung test-driven development is a software development approach where you write the test for your code before you actually write the code itself. So, yun yung ibig sabihin. Yan. It's the reverse. Test cases first, then, tsaka na tayo mag-code. And this is what it looks like if we're going to translate it into a diagram. The first step is write test. We write all the possible scenarios in all possible test cases sa isang unit pa lang. Let's say, for example, the get all expenses. Then, of course, when we're going to run that unit test, it's going to fail. Kasi hindi pa natin nagawa yung code sa function na yun. So, what's going to happen is, in order for this para makaproceed tayo from the red to the green, we write the code na kailangan natin, and then we run again the test cases that we just write in the first step, and we have to make sure nga lahat ng test case na nandoon is mapapasa. All the test cases will pass. And after that, syempre, kung magulo yung code natin, kasi yung concern na naman natin dito is we make sure nga mapass yung test cases. Sometimes, it can be messy, so that's why we perform also refactoring. And let's say tapos na tayo with refactoring and restructuring our code. If there's another feature na naman that we need to implement, let's say we proceed with the add expense. So, again, we write again all the test cases, all possible scenarios, what happens when this test is successful, what happens when this function fails. So, again, we just repeat the cycle for each unit that we're going, or function that we develop. So, that's pretty much about it. Anyway, this is just a concept. It will make more sense once we dive into our actual test-driven development in our next video. Now, why do we perform this approach? Because it gives us an early bug detection. Kasi, the reason nga early, kasi yun nga, nauna kasi yung test cases. The moment that we code and we test again our test case, if there's something wrong, malalaman natin agad. And then clear function method requirements. Of course, we have confidence in refactoring, and yeah, that's pretty much about it in this video in relation to unit testing and test-driven development. So everything that we talk about so far are all concepts pa lang, and it may seem confusing, but don't worry, because in the next video we're going to apply all this theory into our data layer na mga classes. No? First, we're going to apply that to our repository implementation. Then, we're going to apply that to our data sources. And so, yeah, I'm a bit excited on what we're going to do in our next video. But that would be all for today. And if you have any questions, just leave it in the comment section. And I'll see you guys in the next video. That would be all, and goodbye.